Okay, let's see how long I can make this video. This video is to promote my book, and it's also a provisional patent. I've been working on it for more than 8 months, but I've been training myself for several years, more than 4 years, on electrodynamic theory, according to how simulators teach electrodynamic theory. They do have policy written into them. On occasion, it's possible. The main policy is they use matrix algebra to approximate the outcome of a circuit, and that fosters or encourages the utilization of under-unity circuits, thermodynamically compliant circuits that do not create over-unity, and disfavors the over-unity type of circuits. But be that as it may, sometimes I manage to create a circuit that transcends those challenges, or that challenge in particular, and some of the others that a simulator has difficulty with. And I managed to create an exercise in hypothetical thinking as to how did the Amman brothers manage to pull off their exercise in over-unity circuits, running an electric car without any batteries back in 1921. They gave a demonstration in Denver, Colorado. They had at least 2 newspapers show up. We have documentation of the photograph taken and of the insertion of that photograph into one of the newspapers, the Arizona Republic or Arizona Republican. I can't remember which way. They changed their name over the last century, but they're still in business. And a good buddy by the name of Boguslaw over in Europe scanned the newspaper out of his library and sent it to us on Energetic Forum. So we can thank him. And then there's the fellow over on Facebook, Tartaria Mud Flood, who has the original photograph. Although it's been marked, but still the original photograph in pretty good condition. So we know they built it. In fact, we know it worked because one of the brothers went to Washington, D.C. with his EV as a demonstration model to make a patent. And the minute he stepped foot in Washington, D.C. jurisdiction, he was arrested for stealing energy from the grid. So whether or not it's a false arrest, and I do believe it is, a more correct arrest would be domestic terrorist. But they didn't have that phrase back then. Because technically that's exactly what he did. He didn't steal. If anything, he provided energy to some of the people, at least the ones living in downtown Denver, and he disrupted everyone else. So they lost power. And so one could misdiagnose that he stole energy because, why did the customers lose power? Because their power did not arrive to them in a format that they could utilize. It came in the format of useless reactive power, and so consequently it appeared to them that the power went down when in fact it was still there. They couldn't use it. So that's domestic terrorism, when you fuck up somebody's electric utility grid by turning it into anyway, without repeating myself. So I did exercises on microcap and also on LT-Spice, but I had the best success with microcap in trying to train my mind, because the way they built it is not off-the-shelf parts. They made all the parts themselves from scratch, and they were custom-made parts, capacitors and coils. So you can't do it the way they did it. You can't. Now, there are equivalent circuits, and so what I did, there's always that idea in electronic theory that for every circuit there are multiple unknown, indeterminate variety of circuits that will do the same thing, but will be built differently, designed differently, because they'll be equivalent. For all intents and purposes, mathematically they'll be exactly the same, but in terms of the circuit, they won't be. They'll be a different build altogether. And so that's what I tried to do using what was available to me in microcap. And to help me try to imagine in my brain, I don't have a brain like Tesla. I don't have photographic memory, I don't have formal training, and I don't have a simulator for a brain. He had all 3. And so I had to make use of microcap and try to feel my way through this. And I think what I've come to the conclusion is this, that the Amman brothers and Tesla's tri-metal generator are one and the same invention. And what's missing from the equation is that there's a spark gap involved. Because spark gaps, I found, do not have to turn on in order to give a beneficial influence to the circuit that they are inside of. They can remain off. All they have to do is be in there, and they will perform a magic feat. Now, there's another thing to orchestrate a situation in which the coils in that circuit start to generate power, even though they're not moving. Now, this transcends Michael Faraday's law of induction, in which you take a coil of wire or a piece of wire and you move it through a magnetic field and it generates current inside that coil. Well, simply by inverting voltage relative to current by 180 degrees, one whole half cycle of separation, you create a standing wave of reactive power, and you have the definition of a generator. And you don't have to move the coil. The coil generates power anyway. It's just reactive power. It's not watts. But that's okay. It's better than nothing, because now you've gotten yourself off to the worst. You've overcome the worst challenge, is to create something. And all you have to do now is convert it. With electrical theory, it's not hard. Electrical engineers will say, oh, that's useless energy. It's just reactive power. Oh, are you kidding? That's the definition of a generator. 180 degrees phase shift between current and voltage. Are you kidding? So they will say anything to dissuade you, and don't let them. You may be ignorant, but that doesn't mean they're right just because they sound right, just because they have all the formal training in the world. It took me a while to figure out all the arguments against their arguments. It didn't happen right away because I knew nothing. I was, a dummy like everybody else. You flick the light switch. That's all I knew. Where's the gas tank? What do I know? But I trained myself. I read up on their information, and so now I understand where the fraud is, and it's in multiple places. So let's start with fraud number 1, Ohm's law. Twice I tried to take Beginner's 101 course in electrodynamic theory in junior college, in a community college, twice. Second time, I even had pretty girls who wanted to be my lab partner, and it wouldn't work. I had to leave the class because I was incensed. I was angry the way they taught. Now, I blamed it all on the math thing. Oh, it's too much math. The problem wasn't too much math. The problem was that the way they taught Ohm's law is wrong. It's right if you want to be a technician, and apparently that's all they want everybody to be, is to go through the ringer and become a technician, and don't think for yourself. Just do what you're told, get paid, and take care of your honey and your family, and forget about thinking about the cosmic significance of what they're teaching you. What does this mean, Ohm's law? Well, you can't make anything out of it the way they teach it to you. For a reason. They don't want you to make anything out of it. Well, I learned, I've stumbled across another version of Ohm's law. See, what they teach us is what everybody knows. Watts equals, oh dear, I'm getting gas in the car. Oh dear. Okay, maybe I should shut this off. Sorry about this. Hopefully nobody will make a loud sound. Now, watts equals power equals voltage times current. That's the shortcut. That's shortcut notation. There's another version that's more fundamentally, more puritanically correct, and it's voltage squared divided by resistance. There's no current there, nor does there need to be, nor does current exist. So this is the first fraud. Current is a shorthand notation. When you have a complicated mathematical equation, oftentimes what you'll want to do is you'll want to excise, you'll want to subtract a portion of that equation to simplify it, and you replace what you've taken away with a single symbol to represent what you've taken away. And this is what they've done. They've taken away voltage divided by resistance and replaced it with the capital letter I to represent current. So now current times voltage equals watts, instead of voltage squared equals divided by resistance equals watts, because they took away voltage divided by resistance, and they left behind voltage, and they multiply that against this new symbol called current. Now, it's interesting that current is a capital I, because the imaginary number of the square root of -1 is a little case, small letter I, And there's a reason for that, but I may not get to it in this video. I'm just trying to promote my book, so you can read the book to find out all that detail. So they've taken away voltage divided by resistance. Now, what does that mean, voltage divided by resistance? That means change in voltage because of the resistance implies over time. When you take that out, what you're left with is the static pressure of voltage that is either pushing or pulling the current or the change in voltage divided by resistance, depending on the situation. If it's real power, then the voltage is pushing current because the current or the change appears to be happening in a direction in which it's flowing away or moving away. A ripple of change is moving away from higher pressures of voltage and towards lower pressures. But it simply looks like it's moving. It's a ripple. If you ever study wave mechanics and study the mechanics of ripple waves, you'll know that they don't move. They don't move side to side. They move up and down. And it's simply a pattern that our brain recognizes and thinks is a ripple moving sideways, when in fact it's just molecules of water on the surface moving up and down in a certain pattern that makes it look like a ripple. Now, it's significant that that ripple is moving sideways, because that's actually how a cam drive works, a camshaft system works. Now, a camshaft system was invented at least, if not earlier, the time frame when steam engines were invented, because they have to take the action of the reciprocating piston of that steam engine and turn it into a rotating action to rotate the wheels of the front car, the steam engine car, to pull along the rest of the steam engine, the railroad, to pull it along. And there's an interesting fellow by the name of Lathwaite, Lathwaite. He's English. He's now deceased, but he made a series of videos in the 60s or 70s. He's a professor of electrodynamics, and he did one on magnetism. And it's very interesting because he has these rods all lined up in a row like dominoes. They're just rods standing up, and they have rails on either side to make sure they can't move side to side. They can't tip over either, and they can't tip this way because they're squashed, sandwiched on either side by more rods. And they can't tip this way because the railing is in the way. All they can do is move up and down. And underneath them is a screw. And he turns the screw, and the teeth of the screw cause the rods to move up and down in a pattern very reminiscent. If you look at the top edge of all of the rods, it looks like a ripple wave is moving either left to right or right to left, depending on which way he's turning the screw. And on the top, he's got two rails above the top, let's say this wide, right above the resting height of the rods. So as the rods move up and down, the rail is still there on either side, one rail on either side, and then he's got a sphere at one end. And as the rods move up and down, they actually push the sphere along, even though the rods are not moving side to side, yet the ball is moving. And everybody goes, wow. Well, that's how a cam drive works. In our engine inside our car, the pistons move, but they actually rotate the motor shaft, and that in turn rotates the transmission and rotates the tires on our car, the wheels on our car. So it's a known mechanical fact, and yet it makes no sense. When you look at it enough and stare at it, it's like, what the heck is going on? Well, that's what happens to energy traveling down a wire. It doesn't travel. It's information. See, electricity is consciousness. All atoms are alive with consciousness, and the electricity is simply an indication that they are alive and they have intelligence and they keep track of each other, and they have an influence on each other, so that when you're sitting in a baseball stadium or a football stadium or a soccer stadium and you're bored, but everybody decides to do the wave, and you don't move side to side, right? You simply stand up or sit down, and when you stand up, you raise your arms, and when you sit down, you lower your arms. And you look out through the corner of your eye, or maybe you give a quick glance, and you see how quickly the wave is coming to you, and then at the precise moment, you stand up and sit down. And you also keep track of how quickly everybody else is standing up and sitting down. And let's say you want to maintain the speed of the wave, and so you stand up and sit down at the same speed that everybody else is doing. And yet when the wave gets, so on your side you see everybody standing up and sitting down, but on the opposite side the poor perspective, it looks like the wave is moving around the stadium. And you can have two waves in opposite directions at different speeds and cross each other. It's all because people are simply standing up and sitting down. It has nothing to do with anything moving sideways. But the information is. And this is why I used to say, this was my only argument I had available up till now, that the movement of energy down a wire is a fiction. It does not exist. The only thing that moves down the wire is information. The energy within each copper atom is increasing and decreasing, and that's equivalent to people standing up and sitting down in the football stadium. But that's it. And they do it in a certain pattern, though. And it's that pattern we recognize, and our brain simplifies the matter and says, you know what, I'm going to call that a ripple wave, and it's moving sideways, when it's not a ripple wave, unless we know the ripple wave is simply a pattern. Now, let me give you an illustration. When I was 4 or 5 years old, I'd sit in the passenger's seat to the right of my mom, and she'd be driving along, and I'd stare out the window. And I was amazed. I'd be staring at the hubcaps of cars passing by. We'd either be traveling faster than them or slower. And so as they went by, I'd take a look at their hubcaps, and as they sped up or slowed down, the rotation of the hubcap would either slow down or speed up or reverse direction. Now, I knew in my mind that wheel was not going backwards. Yet, that was the fact. I knew that as a fact, but it didn't look that way. I was so impressed. I thought, one of these days I'm going to have to figure out or learn what's going on with that. Well, it's called beat frequencies. When you have a beat frequency, you have a daughter wave that's the product of two or more parent waves. And the daughter wave can be doing anything. It's a mathematical resultant. It results mathematically from the combination of all the parent waves, two or more. And so the daughter wave could be going forward, could be going backwards, could be changing direction, changing speed. Well, that's the phenomenon of a ripple wave. It's a mathematical resultant resulting from the action of the people standing up and down, or the rods moving up and down, or the pistons moving back and forth in an engine, steam engine, or an internal combustion engine of our cars. But we get a rotary action instead, because we've managed to build an interface to translate one energy mechanical movement into another mechanical movement. When electricity, it's the same thing. You've got information running down the wire, not current. There's no current there. All you have is change in voltage over time due to the resistance inside the wire. And then you also have, besides the change in voltage, you also have the static pressure of voltage that's either pushing or pulling. Now, it's pushing if the so-called current is in phase with the voltage phase. But if they're out of phase by 180 degrees, such as a generator or a battery, then you get a standing wave, basically, which doesn't move. The energy's moving, but the wave doesn't. You no longer get this ripple that's moving, you get a ripple that's not moving. So it's still a pattern, because a ripple doesn't exist, but it appears to be not moving. And so now you have a buildup of energy, reactive power, not real power, but reactive power that has nowhere to go. It can't convert into heat, it cannot convert into light, it cannot convert into mechanical motion, and so it stays inside the wire and builds up and builds up and builds up. If you feed it right, if you've got the right circuit to keep that going, then it just keeps self-feeding, like a self-looping situation. It keeps getting more and more amplitude and more power. And so that's, in a nutshell, how the thing works. But it's only recently I found another way to explain the situation is Ohm's law, that current is a fiction. It's a shorthand notation to simplify Ohm's law, to make it more practical for the technician in the field who wants to measure current and who wants to measure voltage. And instead of just measuring voltage and squaring it and then trying to figure out what the resistance is to figure out what the power is, instead of knowing what the current is. So this way they don't have to measure the resistance. They measure the current and they measure the voltage, and then they'll know what the power is. And there are ways of measuring current, even though it's a fiction. Let's say you have a magnet loaded or poised on the end of a spring. And so it's a spring action magnet, and then you put that near the wire, and the wire will create a magnetic field, and so the magnet will be drawn or moved in one direction or another, and then the spring will help a needle move on an ammeter that measures amps, and it'll tell you how much current is going through the wire. And so you've measured current by its influence on a magnet, but you're still measuring a fiction. It does not exist. And because current is a fiction, magnetism is also a fiction. Because magnetism is a product of current, and current is a product of magnetism. You can translate one into the other. So all because of this reinterpretation of the puritanical version of Ohm's law, devoid of any hint of current, did I come to this conclusion that current does not exist. It's a fiction. It's a form of shorthand notation to make the life of the electrical engineer a little easier, to facilitate his work environment, shall we say, his work setup, but it's still a fiction. It does not exist. And I'll let you chew on that for a while, because that's a lot right there. But once you have that, now the whole field is open to question everything. See, all you have to do is question authority. I've been doing that ever since I was a toddler. But once you start, though, but I'm brainwashed like everybody else is. So I have to pick something to work on it, and then I start to realize it falls apart because the way I've been brainwashed to think about it is not true. I mean, it is true, but it's not really the best way to think about it. You know, it's not like they've lied. It's just there are better ways of thinking about it in order to elicit this idea that Ohm's law validates, justifies free energy. This is the point of this video. And this was the result of my segregated analysis, as Jim Murray advises us to do. He's an electrical engineer who used to be who was initially trained to be a physicist, and then he switched to electrical engineering because he thought it would pay better. And he's had quite a life of experiences. Well, he wrote a book on the meaning of unity in energy conversion systems. I believe is the title. Jim Murray, M-U-R-R-A-Y. You can look him up on Amazon or other booksellers. And he has said, I haven't read the book, but I think he's that's the point of the book, and he has said it in his presentations. Do a segregated analysis to really be thorough in finding out what's going on. And so I decided to do that. So microcap gives me all this information I never make use of. Why don't I have it tell me every single component in the circuit at any point in time I wish? What's the current and what's the voltage? And I discovered something uncanny, that sometimes the product, the multiplicative product of the current and voltage is negative, and sometimes it's positive. And I discovered that when it's negative, it means its reactive power out of phase, the current is out of phase with the voltage by 180 degrees. But if the power is positive, then it's real power. The other way is reactive power is real power, and it's being consumed, namely converted by some component, let's say an incandescent bulb, and being turned into light and heat. But if it's negative, it's being produced. It's reactive power that's being produced. So this is how I started to realize that a spark gap does some interesting things. You don't have to ignite the spark gap in order to get it to get, as I said before, coils to start producing reactive power. It can simply be present, not lit, the spark gap. And a spark gap is a very interesting thing. You know, a switch, a mechanical switch, is a spark gap. You ever think of that? When you take a mechanical switch and you start to close it, it's open, and you start to close it, you're bringing two contact pieces of metal closer and closer together. And what are you doing? You're increasing capacitance. And what is that called? Parametric amplification through capacitance variation. And by increasing the capacitance, you're actually increasing the charge that's across those 2 points, those two plates, the dielectric of airspace between them. You're increasing because you're compressing the width between them. And you know, capacitance is the square area of the contact plate on either side of the switch versus the distance. And when you start changing that proportional ratio, you're changing the energy that's stored there. Whatever the energy is, even if you don't add any more energy, it's going to change just because you've changed the capacitance. So this is the second aspect, what I've learned some time ago, that the electrical formula of electrical reactance regulates free energy, but it's Ohm's law and its derivative, Mohs law, that justifies it. And I'm going to finish on one point. Lord Kelvin must be rolling in his grave because he suggested the Mo. He's the one who suggested it in the first place. And Lord Kelvin goes back a ways, right? It's like more than a century or something, the late 1880s or whatever. He suggested the Mo, which is ohm spelled backwards. And you know what happens? The people in charge, the international body of people in charge of our units of measurement, our scientific units of measurement, they said, we're not going to allow that to happen. We're going to take the Mo and throw it away, and we're going to replace it with Siemens. Now, there's no connection between Siemens and Moh's law. Namely, I'm not going to get into it, but I'll just mention it. Ohm's law, the multiplicative inverse of Ohm's law, and the additive inverse, because you have to do both in order to make any sense of Moh's law in any practical way. I mean, it has to match, conditions. The inversion of voltage relative to current by 180 degrees. So you have to have an additive inversion, which means a negation, as well as a multiplicative inversion in which the denominator and the numerator of Ohm's law switch places. So now instead of volts squared divided by resistance of Ohm's law, now under Moh's law, you have resistance divided by voltage squared, which and negated. And what that does is, see, under Ohm's law, it's very hard to deal with energy because you've got voltage squared divided by resistance. That means you have to magnify your voltage and reduce your resistance to get anything done because your resistance is undermining your voltage. But in Moh's law, which is the equivalent of conductivity, which they call admittance, the electrical engineers, but we just call it conductivity, you and I. Under Moh's law, everything is turned topsy-turvy, in which you are encouraged to reduce your voltage, because now you've got voltage squared in the denominator of Moh's law, and increase your resistance, because now you've got resistance in the numerator of Moh's law, to get more conductivity. And you know what happens when you get more conductivity? You get more results on less voltage and more resistance. It's totally backwards. All you have to do, though, is invert voltage relative to current by a whole half cycle of alternating phases of voltage. So your voltage phase and your current phase have to be out of phase by 180 degrees, and you can create all the power you want indirectly by increasing your conductivity. Now you've got superconductivity at room temperature. Okay, so these are the things that I've bumped across. And so now I missed the last thing I was going to tell you. I got sidebarred here. Oh yes, Lord Kelvin. So now to finish that thought. So Mo was pushed aside. Now we have Siemens instead of Mo, and so there's no relationship between Mo and Moh's law anymore, and conductivity, because we have Siemens getting in the way, obstructing our view of Mo and Moh's law and the multiplicative inversion of Ohm's law to give us an understanding of where free energy comes from. But we have something else happen. When they replaced Mo with Siemens, they also did something else. We're going to screw the people one more time. We're going to name absolute zero temperature after Lord Kelvin himself, which suggests to everyone that only through the supercooling effect of absolute zero will you get superconductivity at all. And of course, this is not the only way to do it. That's the hard way to do it. I'm telling you the easier way is to simply take voltage out of phase from current by 180 degrees in your circuit. So you power it with very little voltage, and you use a elevated resistance in all the right places, and you super saturate. What you do is you saturate a capacitor somewhere, or a pair of capacitors, to get them saturated all the time, so now they can't absorb energy anymore. And it takes time to absorb energy to charge up a capacitor and to discharge the capacitor. But if they're saturated, now all it can do is reflect the voltage that's coming in because it can't absorb it. It's already saturated. And wouldn't you know it, when it reflects voltage, it's spontaneous. It's instantaneous. There is no time lag because there's no current. There's no voltage to change over time. So it gets reflected immediately. And that's where you get the 180-degree phase shift, is you get a capacitor acting not as an absorber of energy that's later on going to discharge it. Instead, it reflects it instantaneously. And that's the magic of inverting voltage and getting superconductivity at room temperature and free energy.